Well, good morning. My name is Eric Patterson. I serve as Executive Vice President of the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. And let me first say my thanks to the team here. Cole Durham's been a friend for a long time of our organization. I'm grateful to Elizabeth Clark for all of her work on this. Brett Scharfs serves on our advisory board. One of BYU Law's outstanding alumna, Hannah Clayson-Smith, serves on our governing board. And so it feels like we have many, many friends, and I see other ones in the room, and we're delighted to be here. And my talk today is to brief you on what's often called the MED Act, a legislative approach to protect the medical conscience rights of healthcare providers. And we have good news. At about 5 p.m. last night, South Carolina passed that legislation, the Medical Ethics and Diversity Act. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. At RFI, our mission is to achieve broad acceptance of religious freedom as a fundamental human right, as a source of individual and societal flourishing, as the cornerstone of a successful society, and as a driver of national and international security. So we have a broad sense across different sectors and domains of public life in the U.S. and around the world. Now, you've all heard in the news many of the types of egregious cases where a doctor or a nurse or medical student, their fundamental conscience has been violated by some sort of coercion. For instance, a medical or nursing student who's told that they have to sign an affidavit that they'll participate in an abortion, or the very well-known case from a couple of years ago at the University of Vermont's Medical Center, where a nurse was told that she was going into a procedure, she scrubbed up, she went inside, and then the doctor said to her, "Oh, don't hate me." And she had been tricked into participating in an abortion despite the fact that she was on a list of names of people who would not participate in abortions at the medical center. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these cases out there. So what this legislation is designed to do is to protect the fundamental conscience rights of doctors and nurses and mental health professionals in areas like euthanasia, abortion, transgender procedures, mental health services, and down the road, increasing experimentation in transformative medical procedures. Now, all of this is really rooted, as this conference is, into a concept of human dignity. Doctors, nurses, and others take an oath, and that oath begins with the principle of do no harm. And so it's not just protecting the dignity of the patient, but it's also protecting the dignity of that professional. In other words, do we really want our doctors or nurses to leave their moral convictions at the door before they go to work every day? And of course, the answer to that is no. So what needs protecting? And let me just mention 4 of the who's, if you will, who need protecting under this act. Of course, the first and the most obvious are healthcare practitioners, and that's a wide group. It's not just the lead doctor, but we're talking also in the areas of medical education, mental health professions, and the like. The second, of course, are medical institutions. Sometimes they seem like amorphous bureaucracies, but they're really people united around a common mission. And what would happen if we knocked out all the faith-based clinics in the inner city, or we took out Catholic, Lutheran, and Jewish hospitals? The third are our payers, so professionals, institutions, but those who are paying. That means insurance. It means taxpayers who have convictions about what they don't want to support in this realm. And of course, last but certainly not least, are patients. And patients is an important category because we're not just talking about a patient who wants to have some limits on what is done to them, but what we're also talking about, most importantly, I think these days, the front line is really parental rights. Parents being the one to make the decisions about what happens in the medical cases of their children, not some sort of new ideology that says that their child should be changed through hormone treatments or radical surgeries or other experiments. Now, there are 2 nuances in these cases that I want to note. The first one is the idea of mandatory referrals. And what I often hear is, well, doesn't it protect the conscience rights of that doctor if he doesn't do it, but he just refers it to someone else who will? Well, if you take a deep breath for a moment and reflect on that, I mean, do you really feel comfortable when someone thinks that something is a sin or morally objectionable, and they're going to just pass the buck? They're going to pass the responsibility of that to someone else? Of course not. And so this difference between referral and performance, we need to protect the right to not refer. And then second, I'm sometimes told, well, this sounds very exclusive, Eric, and these medical conscience rights, don't we need to be operating from a principle of inclusivity? Well, what do we mean by inclusivity? Here's what I would say is the wrong view. The wrong view would be to say that all healthcare workers must be required or coerced to perform all procedures at all times on demand. I don't think we really feel comfortable with that, right? That's not inclusivity. Here's inclusivity. Inclusivity is when medical professionals can operate from their own firm convictions and values and support the patients from those communities that share their similar beliefs and values. Here's an example. Regina Frost is an African-American, female, Christian OBGYN. And she became famous 2 years ago because New York State was going to impose new legislation that would force OBGYNs in the state either to perform abortions or to refer their patients to them. So she wrote a famous open letter in which she said, as a woman and as a medical professional who's taken the Hippocratic Oath, how can I counsel a woman in one room about how to nurture life and then walk into the next room and kill it? I cannot do that. Now, we've been saying for a long time, particularly among OBGYNs, how do we find enough people of color? How do we find enough women to be OBGYNs? How do we find enough people to serve in their own communities to be trusted in these areas? And she's the type of person who would be run out of the industry, run out of this opportunity for service by this type of law. So the Medical Ethics and Diversity Act in South Carolina and elsewhere is an important protection. Let me give you a status update of where this legislation is. In 2020, it passed in Ohio and Arkansas. And like I said, literally just last night, it cleared the final hurdle in the South Carolina Senate to pass. So what's next? Well, over the next couple of years, other states will take this up. Some already have. Texas took it up last summer, but you may remember that Texas had a chaotic legislative session where the Democrats left the state and very little passed. This looked like it was going to pass, and there just wasn't time. Texas meets only every other year with its legislature, so it'll be back up next year. But I'd say that what we need over time are also legislative protections that protect medical conscience rights in the areas of licensure, in the application to medical schools, in how we think about accreditation, in continuing education, and professional standards, and in standards of care. Now, let me just conclude by saying this. How could you help? Because I think a big theme in this conference is, what are the ways that I as a citizen, or I as a lawyer, or I as someone who could sponsor an event or something could help? So here's a few things. You could host a briefing or an event or a seminar around this in your church or your parish or in your community. Law schools like BYU Law School and other places around the country are going to need to provide, I think, increasing professional education for our graduate students to be prepared for these challenges. If you're an expert in the field, such as a mental health counselor or a doctor, and you would be willing to provide testimony, expert testimony down the road, or to ride on these issues, let us know. We would be happy to provide you with those types of opportunities. We need people who will explain this to the public. There is an education component. Many people I talk to think, oh, doctors are protected. They kind of do whatever they want. You know, that is really not the case in the society in which we live. And we need to do a better job of disseminating information about what these challenges are today. The good news is that legislators in 3 states have passed this legislation, and I'm optimistic about it in other places. It's one of the key ways that we can protect the faith convictions of our neighbors and these who serve us. Thank you.